the absolute and the one, that the amorphic absolute of metaphysical monism is inexpressible in language, which by its own symbolic nature is delimited to the conditioned realm of spatio-temporality, or in any other symbol, is a verity universally acknowledged by both the metaphysics of the world of modern Western philosophy and by the theosophic metaphysics of the traditional writers. Nonetheless, some metaphysicists have attempted an expression of it, though not in any conscious hope of achieving success or by laboring under the principle that, in Coomaraswamy's words, a symbol participates in its referent or archetype. Rather, these attempts are usually framed in the negative. For example, Eckhart's via negativa, since the absolute is so utterly transcendent relative to human cognition or anything else, sensible or intelligible, that only by framing it in the negative can the student gain any direction whatsoever. Even these negative attempts, however, have led to a wide variety of terms that often bewilder the student in their profusion, terms that are inevitably doomed to failure, like arrows shot at the sun. This is a fact not unknown to those who shoot these arrows, but though the arrows cannot participate in the referent, for even the term referent is inapplicable relative to the absolute, they do indicate direction, the direction of the disciple's quest for liberation. Direction is essential in this quest, since it is neither the path nor its indicator that should be important to the aspirant, but rather awareness and acknowledgement of the absolute. This problem is recognized in an old Buddhist proverb about pointing one's finger at the moon, whose rendering in French is «Quand le doigt montre la lune, l'imbécile regarde le doigt», and when there exists a multiplicity of fingers or indicators, the probability of confusion is high. Thus, statements of any type about the absolute are best left unsaid, and so they are in the theosophic and traditional writings too, with only the exceptions that the absolute is beyond both limitation and non-limitation, that is, futile to try to conceive or express. In one of very few references to the absolute in Coomaraswamy's writings, he states that the absolute, para Brahman, aditi, is also, of course, unintelligible, but in another way, being neither an object, natural or artificial, nor even an intellectual form or idea. The absolute, being amurta, formless, nirabhasa, unmanifested, not in any likeness, impossible to symbolize because not a form, does not fall to be considered here. Blavatsky established the absolute as one of the three fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine as an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. It is beyond the range and reach of thought, in the words of Mandukya Upanishad, unthinkable and unspeakable. It is, of course, devoid of all attributes and is essentially without any relation to manifested finite being. Guénon is somewhat more evasive about commenting on the absolute and presumably refers to it using different terms in different works. For example, the absolute in La Métaphysique Orientale, infinity in The Multiple States of Being, the supreme principle in L'homme et son devenir selon le Vedanta, and simply the principle in La Grande Triade, where he describes it as being beyond all distinction, not able to be correlated to anything whatsoever. Guénon's various references to it were entirely consistent with those of the metaphysicists just cited with regard to its attributes. More problematic is the relationship between the absolute and the one, or God, or metaphysical unity. The same terminological confusion exists relative to both principles. Little treatment other than passing references exists on this relationship. Blavatsky claims simply that para Brahman is not God because it is not a God, and further unwraps this seed thought in the proem of The Secret Doctrine. And Frithjof Schuon writes that it is true that God as creator, revealer, and savior is not to be identified with the absolute as such. It is equally true that God as such, in the full depth of his reality, is not to be reduced to the creative function. Thus, what is implicit in this metaphysical speculation is that there is a step-down process, the mechanics of which, the transition from the absolute to the one or God, are equally as unknowable or incognizable as the absolute itself. But once the one manifests, once God or being appears sui generis, somewhat more metaphysical certitude accompanies it. This is not the one or one being of Parmenides and Plato, which more closely correlates to the absolute, but rather the next step in a process that involves to the many and evolves back to the one. With the appearance of the one, the contingent or conditioned realms of relativity and axiology follow, and the cycle begins. Functionally, it is the one that takes a preeminent place in metaphysics, and it is the foundational a priori postulate upon which are built the theosophical systems and traditional systems. This one is, to use a simple analogy of finite dimension, the zenith of a pyramid from which all creation graduates in reverse, as it were. To use another geometric analogy, it can be likened to the intangible center point of a sphere of existence that radiates outward but without radial boundary, concurrently superimposed upon the modern physicist's concept of the fluidic nature, owing to its fundamentally atomic or subatomic composition of the phenomenal universe of matter-motion, in which differentiation is due to finite and mutable forms. Mathematically, the number one is both odd and even. The aspect of this manifestation of the one into its separate forms rests on its being the progenitive principle from which all emanates, including the other principles. This aspect is the one that gives so much difficulty to empirically bound thinkers, yet it is the paradoxical aspect that Coomaraswamy expresses as being everywhere impartite, whether transcendent or immanent, or again as undivided amongst divided things. This is an indispensable key for the understanding of the Philosophia Perennis, Theosophy, the tradition, truly the first of first principles, for it is the task of the seeker to identify with the Atman or Sanctus Spiritus within himself, realizing simultaneously his being in the one and the illusion, Maya, of thinking himself separate from it. It is the one, with its inscrutable relation to the absolute, which can be described as unity. Guénon writes that being is one, or rather it is metaphysical unity itself, but unity embraces multiplicity within itself, since it produces it by the mere extension of its possibilities. It is for this reason that even in being itself a multiplicity of aspects may be conceived which constitute so many attributes or qualifications of it. These first metaphysical principles of the Absolute and the One, and God, whose attribution to either of the former principles depends on the particular writer in question, and the diaphanous distinction between them are the cornerstones of the traditional and theosophic systems, since it is from them that all manifestation ultimately proceeds, and to them that it ultimately returns. The timelessness and subsequent polarity of this process point to the interdependence of the principles inherent in it, as will be seen presently, and also to the contingent application of these principles as the promulgation of theosophy and the tradition in various cultures throughout time. The principial unity of the one, for example, is reflected in the idea of the same principles being found in the historical systems or manifestations of the great religions, and in the writings of the magnanimous philosophers. More recently, and relative to the areas now under discussion, this specific concept is reflected by the Theosophist and Coomaraswamy's friend, Bhagavan Das, writing The Essential Unity of All Religions in 1932, and Frithjof Schuon writing De l'unité transcendante des religions in 1948. Aviternity. It is a fact seldom disputed by modern scientists that the quantitative notions of space and time are not only convenient constructs of intellectual origination, but are inextricable notions. That is, time, duration, finds its meaning and existence only within the category of space, dimension. Thus, one often finds the two notions in hyphenated union, for example, spatio-temporality. Yet scientists and those of an empirical orientation do not postulate further, as do the theosophic and traditional writers, since in their view such postulation constitutes intrusion into the unholy realm of metaphysics. Ever since the discussion of an eternal present by Plato in the Timaeus, 37d to 38c, and Aristotle's atomos nein, which Coomaraswamy translates simply as now without duration, the concept of aviternity, from the Latin aviternus, meaning eternal existence, everlasting immanent duration, has been among the first principles of Western perennial philosophers. Historians of Christianity and Christian theologians meet with the principle in Augustine. God is himself in no interval nor extension of place, but in his immutable preeminent all possibility is both within everything, because all things are in him, and without everything, because he transcends all things. So too he is in no interval nor extension of time, but in his immutable eternity is the principle of all things, because he is metaphysically prior to all things, and the end of all things, because the same he is after all things. Moreover, the schoolmen dealt with the principle in their writings. Aquinas states that there is no before or after to be reckoned with in constant changeless reality, since the now of time is not time. The now of eternity is really the same as eternity. The principle can be found in discussions of other traditional cultures and worldviews as well. In the third volume of papers from the Eranos yearbooks entitled Man and Time, for instance, Henri Corbin addresses his prefatory remarks to the proclivity of Western moderns to reduce real time to abstract physical time, to the essentially quantitative time which is that of the objectivity of mundane calendars, from which the signs that gave a sacred qualification to every present have disappeared. This proclivity stands in contradistinction to the theosophic or traditional perspective that Henri-Charles Puech sees reflected in the worldview of the Hellenistic Gnostics. Gnostic time is only the consequence and the reflection of the adventures or conflict of transcendent realities, an episodic copy of an atemporal tragedy, and the Gnostic's effort is to transcend time in order to establish himself, as absolutely as possible, in the world of atemporal realities, in a universe that is intelligible and given eternally. Following this paper is one of Mircea Eliade on Indic conceptions of aeviternity, in which he claims that in their perspective, by transcending the universe, the created world, one also transcends time and achieves stasis, the eternal, intemporal present. This eternal present, or eternal now, Coomaraswamy refers to in different ways. In Vedanta and Western tradition, he refers to it as the now-ever. But this is a didactic essay, in contrast to his formally pedagogic essays and books in which he generally refers to this principle by the term that stems from its Latin antecedent, aeviternity. Coomaraswamy's book, Time and Eternity, which treats this theme, contrasts these notions as they are found in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, ancient Greece, and modernity. There, in perhaps his most succinct statement on the subject, he writes that the metaphysical doctrine simply contrasts time as a continuum with the eternity that is not in time, and so cannot properly be called everlasting, but coincides with the real present, or now, of which temporal experience is impossible. Here, confusion only arises because for any consciousness functioning in terms of time and space, now succeeds now without interruption, and there seems to be an endless series of nows, collectively adding up to time. This confusion can be eliminated if we realize that none of these nows has any duration and that, as measures, all alike are zeros, of which a sum is unthinkable. It is a matter of relativity. It is we who move, while the now is unmoved and only seems to move, much as the sun only seems to rise and set because the earth revolves. Furthermore, Coomaraswamy makes a distinction between the principles of eternity and aeviternity. The former denotes time without beginning or end, while the latter includes the former denotation but adds the element of nowness as encompassing the whole of it. Coomaraswamy's most succinct formulation of aeviternity is found in his essay Recollection, Indian and Platonic. There he states that only from this point of view, temporal omnipresence, can the notion of a providence be made intelligible, the divine life being uneventful, not in the sense that it knows nothing of what we call events, but inasmuch as all of the events of what are for us past and future times are present to it now, and not in succession. With perfect agreement on this point, Guénon follows suit. Metaphysically, it is never a question of priority and of posterity except in the sense of a causal and purely logical chain, which cannot exclude the simultaneity of all things in the eternal present. The aeviternity of the traditional writers finds an exact parallel in modern theosophy. Blavatsky gives a lucid explanation of the essential differences between the empirical illusion of time and eternal duration. Time is only an illusion produced by the succession of our states of consciousness as we travel through eternal duration, and it does not exist where no consciousness exists in which the illusion can be produced, but lies asleep. The present is only a mathematical line which divides that part of eternal duration which we call the future from that part which we call the past. Nothing on earth has real duration, for nothing remains without change, or the same, for the billionth part of a second, and the sensation we have of the actuality of the division of time known as the present comes from the blurring of that momentary glimpse, or succession of glimpses of things that our senses give us, as those things pass from the region of ideals, which we call the future, to the region of memories that we name the past. And the Theosophic metaphysicist Portman is concerned about theologians as well as philosophers who are conscious of the possibility of experiencing eternity already here and now. This possibility of experiencing is one way of saying that it is a matter of metaphysical acuity of the individual to be able to experience this aeviternity, since it is not a principle that is rationally or empirically conceivable. The experience of such a principle is confined to the metaphysical realm of intelligibility. Wilbur Urban refers to the metaphysical idiom of the timeless present, describing it as the interpenetration which negates the mutual externality of successive moments of time, or the succession of glimpses, as Blavatsky phrases it. Aeviternity is thus of the essential, intelligible realm whose center point is the non-spatial, and wherein the etiologic principles of God or the One, when not ascribed to the Absolute, reside. To experience God or the One is to simultaneously experience aeviternity, the latter being the principle in which the ebb and flow of universes occur, and subsuming the principle that is epiphenomenal to it, periodicity. Periodicity. Traditional and theosophic writers sometimes compare the universe to the mammalian heart. With a diastolic and systolic action, it appears and disappears, manifestation and non-manifestation, Manvantara and Mahapralaya in Sanskrit terminology. Between the Mahapralayas and Manvantaras, between non-manifestations are manifestations, and so on. These periods of manifestation are marked by cycles, smaller within larger, but all following more or less the same pattern of periodicity. One finds that these cyclic patterns exhibit some universal features, one prominent of which is that they contain a quaternity that equates, as we had occasion to observe earlier, to wholeness. This wholeness is often symbolized by the circle, and the quaternio within by the cross, whose intersection forms 4 quadrants of the circle whole. Additionally, to indicate that the eternity periodicity process is not static, it is often symbolized by the circular Ouroboros. Traditional Indian metaphysics has developed an elaborate structure of principial periodicity, an intricate cycles within cycles cosmology encompassing billions of terrestrial years. The essential element in this avalanche of figures is the cyclical character of cosmic time, the same phenomenon, creation, destruction, new creation, foreshadowed in each yuga, dawn and dusk, but fully realized in a Maha-yuga, is repeated over and over. Forming a quaternio, there are 4 yugas in a Maha-yuga: Krita Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Guénon dispassionately asserts that his whole perspective of the loss of tradition in the West and the decline of tradition in the East is in fact due to the vicissitudes of the Kali Yuga, the Yuga in which the 20th century CE is currently situated, that is, the last quarter of the cyclic progression of the Maha-yuga. Chapter 1 of La Crise du Monde Moderne, for instance, is titled L'Âge Sombre, at the beginning of which he writes, "We are presently in the 4th age, the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age, and have been there since an epoch much earlier than all those which are known to classical history. Since then, the truths which were formerly accessible to all mankind have become more and more hidden and difficult to attain. Those who possess access to them have become fewer and fewer in number, and if the treasure of non-human wisdom prior to all the ages can never be lost, it nonetheless becomes enveloped in veils more and more impenetrable, which hide it from view, and under which it is extremely difficult to discover." Were the statement alone in Guénon's writings regarding periodicity, which it is not, it would nonetheless be enough to deduce that central to and inherent in his works is the underlying principle of periodicity. In a posthumous publication entitled Formes traditionnelles et cycles cosmiques, Paris, 1970, there appears one of Guénon's essays entitled Remarques sur la doctrine des cycles cosmiques. He states there that, moreover, by virtue of the law of correspondence upon which all things in universal existence rely, there is always and necessarily a certain analogy either between the different cycles of the same order or between the principal cycles and their secondary divisions. This relates not only to the cycles within cycles principle on the one hand, but to another profound principle on the other, namely the so-called Hermetic axiom found in the Tabula Smagardina that is commonly rendered as above, so below. This principle, which Guénon variously refers to as the law of correspondence or the law of harmony, is central to both the theosophic and the traditional writers, and provides not just the notion of periodicity, but all the first principles under discussion here. Coomaraswamy was more reluctant to advertise yuga periodicity as a fundamental axiom of his faith, as did Guénon, but his writings are nonetheless replete with the principle of cycles. In one of the most illustrative essays dealing with this topic, The Flood in Hindu Tradition, he equates the various flood myths incidentally noted to the Hindu flood myth, the others being Sumerian, Semitic, and Eddaic. He states there that floods are a normal and recurrent feature of the cosmic cycle, i.e. the period, para, of a Brahma's life, amounting to 36,000 kalpas or days of angelic time. He explicates the whole notion of cosmic ebb and flow from the standpoint of these several different linguistic and traditional systems, and observes that the close of periods of cosmic manifestation are essentially resolutions of manifested existences into their undetermined potentiality. Blavatsky's commentary on the principle of periodicity is, again, both complementary to the understanding of Coomaraswamy and Guénon and self-evident. She affirms that the second assertion of the secret doctrine is the absolute universality of that law of periodicity, of flux and reflux, ebb and flow, which physical science has observed and recorded in all departments of nature. An alternation such as that of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking, is a fact so common, so perfectly universal and without exception, that it is easy to comprehend that in it we see one of the absolutely fundamental laws of the universe. The theosophical perspective of periodicity as a first principle is perfectly consistent with the traditional perspective of Guénon and Coomaraswamy, and it is important to remember the historical fact that the latter perspective follows in the wake of the former, as Webb notes. Yet the principle of periodicity has several ancillary principles which bring to mind what Guénon previously refers to as the law of correspondence upon which all things in universal existence rely. The macrocosmic first principle of periodicity must necessarily include within it, by the law of correspondence, the microcosmic cycle of human reincarnation, or transmigration, together with the notion of evolution. It must be stated unequivocally at this point that the perception that Guénon and Coomaraswamy held of how modern theosophy regarded reincarnation is divorced from the actuality of its views. This divorce is evident in Coomaraswamy's and especially Guénon's criticisms of the principal points of teaching of modern theosophy, and is due to the fact that the erudition and open attitudes characteristic of the early days of the Theosophical movement, 1875 to 1895, had undergone a change by the time Guénon and Coomaraswamy came under its influence. It was further due to the facts that Erich Hoffer's true believer syndrome, in a spiritual mode, had infiltrated the Theosophical movement by the 1920s, and that some, though still not all, of the allegations of misinterpreting or oversimplifying recondite metaphysical principles did occur on the part of some theosophists. It seems lost to Guénon and Coomaraswamy, however, that Blavatsky had earlier staged pitched battles with segments of the spiritualist movement regarding the individual's morphology in post-mortem states, that she took an essentially Buddhist approach. It, the pilgrim, is the only immortal and eternal principle in us, she writes in The Secret Doctrine, being an indivisible part of the integral whole, the universal spirit, from which it emanates, and into which it is absorbed at the end of the cycle. It is this pilgrim, elsewhere referred to as the monad, the two-in-one, which undergoes the long series of metempsychoses and reincarnation. The central point of misunderstanding concerns the perception of the traditional writers that the superessential and indivisible divine element, together with surviving personality, an aggregation of emotions, mind, and personal memories, was thought by theosophists to incarnate in successive corporeal forms, a notion that Blavatsky did not promulgate. For Coomaraswamy, in the reincarnation process, only the intellectual virtues survive. This is not the survival of a personality that was a property bequeathed when we departed. It is the continued being of the very person so-and-so, no longer encumbered by the grossest of so-and-so's former definitions. He concludes in complete agreement with Blavatsky that, in this way, by a succession of deaths and rebirths, all of the fences may be crossed. The second ancillary principle to be mentioned under the rubric of periodicity is that of evolution, and with it the idea of the helix, since they are inseparable. Guénon writes that, "We know that a horizontal plane represents one state of being, each modality of which corresponds to a spiral turn that we have merged with a circumference. On the other hand, in reality the extremities of the turn do not lie in the plane of the curve, but rather in two immediately adjacent planes, for this curve envisaged in the vertical cylindrical systems is a spiral, a function of the helix, whose thread is infinitesimal. Coomaraswamy refers less specifically to the helix, but describes a spiral having for its center the vertical axis of the universe, and the helico-evolution of individual reincarnation. Two directions of motion, he writes of this process, one circumferential and determinate, the other centripetal and free, have been distinguished, but I have not made it clear that their resultant can be properly indicated only by a spiral. Blavatsky agrees. This tracing of spiral lines refers to the evolution of man's as well as nature's principles, an evolution which takes place gradually, as does everything else in nature. The ideas of helix and evolution in the theosophical and traditional writings have little to do with the normative meaning or definition of evolution a la Darwin and the origin of species. For some unknown reason, modern theosophy has often been singled out as containing an evolutionistic worldview in a sense parallel to Darwin's. Mircea Eliade, for instance, writes that Madame Blavatsky presented a theory of indefinite spiritual evolution through metempsychosis and progressive initiation. But I must interrupt at this point to observe that if there is anything characteristic of all Eastern traditions, it is precisely an anti-evolutionistic conception of the spiritual life. Yet Coomaraswamy, in describing this succession of deaths and rebirths, states that for us, then, there is an alternation of evolution and involution, but for the central spectator, there is no succession of events. And Guénon echoes this thought. Etymologically, indeed, these terms, evolution and involution, signify nothing more nor less than development and envelopment. But we are well aware that in modern language the word evolution has acquired quite a different meaning, which has almost converted it into a synonym for progress. The asterisk alludes to a rather significant footnote where Guénon agrees to use the term as he does in his chapter heading Posthumous Evolution. In this sense, but only in this sense, it would be possible to apply these terms to the two phases that are distinguishable in every cycle of manifestation. One might ask whether Blavatsky's usage of evolution was different from these. The answer is decidedly not. The Darwinian theory, she writes, of the transmission of acquired faculties is neither taught nor accepted in occultism. Evolution in it proceeds on quite other lines. In a thought almost encapsulating the entire argument here, Blavatsky writes elsewhere that before we can approach the evolution of physical and divine man, we have first to master the idea of cyclic evolution. Finally, one last point needs to be made that could be described as a transition between periodicity and polarity, the next principle to be considered. This is a phenomenon regarding the dynamic of periodicity and polarity, which is that the seed forms or archetypes of the opposite pole of the axis within the cycle reside in the one presently occurring. So, when the Mahapralaya, or flood, destroys the antediluvian world, the seeds or archetypes of the next manifestation, or Manvantara, survive as possibilities. In each case, writes Coomaraswamy, the seeds, ideas, or images of the future manifestation persist during the interval of intertime of resolution on a higher plane of existence, unaffected by the destruction of manifested forms. There are terms for this dynamic, referred to as the compensation theory, and enantiodromia that operate in tandem to ensure the viability of continuity or survival from one cycle or phase of a cycle to another. Carl Jung discusses this dynamic at length in his works, describing enantiodromia as the regulative function of opposites, and a running contrariwise by which he, Heraclitus, meant that sooner or later everything runs into its opposite. The most useful symbol for the comprehension of this dynamic, though the symbol itself is static, is the Chinese yin-yang symbol, which contains the white seed or nucleus in the black half and the black seed or nucleus in the white half. In Jung's most succinct statement on the compensation enantiodromia dynamic, which Guénon describes in similar terms, referring to it as reinstatement, he writes, "Of these, yin and yang, it is said that always when one principle reaches the height of its power, the counter-principle is stirring within it like a germ. This is another particularly graphic formulation of the psychological law of compensation by an inner opposite. Whenever a civilization reaches its highest point, sooner or later a period of decay sets in. But the apparently meaningless and hopeless collapse into a disorder without aim or purpose nevertheless contains within its darkness the germ of a new light. The incessant interplay between these forces is only another way of perceiving the spiraling process of periodic evolution, in which the notion of polarity plays such a significant part." polarity, duality, coincidentia oppositorum. The concept of polarity and the synthesis of its poles was already discussed, though not in great detail, above, in the chapter entitled The Complexio Oppositorum of Quantity and Quality, with specific reference to those concepts. It serves no purpose to repeat here what was said there, but, keeping the former in mind, our purpose now is to extend the dimensions of the principle of polarity or duality and its synthesis to the macrocosmic proportions of metaphysics, and in turn to examine how, by the law of correspondence, theosophists and traditionalists apply this principle to a microcosm, that is, to humankind. Blavatsky, like Coomaraswamy and Guénon, often addresses the principle of polarity, or contrasts, or opposites, and in reference to various phenomena. Among her most succinct statements, and one which does a perfect job in corresponding the macro principle with the micro subject, is the following. Esoteric philosophy admits neither good nor evil per se as existing independently in nature. The cause for both is found, as regards the cosmos, in the necessity of contraries or contrasts, and with respect to man, in his human nature, his ignorance and passions. There is no devil or the utterly depraved, as there are no angels absolutely perfect, though there may be spirits of light and darkness. Thus Lucifer, the spirit of intellectual enlightenment and freedom of thought, is metaphorically the guiding beacon which helps man to find his way through the rocks, Symplegades, and sandbanks of life, for Lucifer is the Logos in his highest, and the adversary in his lowest, both of which are reflected in our ego. Guénon treats the same subject at length, both in Le Symbolisme de la Croix, particularly in chapters 6 and 7, entitled respectively L'Union des Complémentaires and La Résolution des Oppositions, and in La Grande Triade, his principal treatise on Taoism. But as the poles or bases of all manifestation, Guénon looks to Indian thought and expresses this principle via the notions of Purusha and Prakriti. The correlative of Purusha is then Prakriti, the undifferentiated primordial substance. It is the passive principle, which is represented as feminine, while Purusha, also called Pumas, is the active principle represented as masculine. And these two are the poles of all manifestation, though remaining unmanifested themselves. It is undeniable, as we have seen, that the first principle of polarity is central to both Blavatsky and Guénon. With Coomaraswamy, it is almost a leitmotif. Few themes within the Philosophia Perennis intrigue Coomaraswamy as much as polarity, both in the macrocosmic principles of metaphysics and in the human condition, where the incidents of opposites and their synthesis provide Coomaraswamy with his most favored and meaningful material. It is reflected in the numerous references and indeed whole essays like Symplegades and the Tantric Doctrine of Divine Biunity, in which he treats the subject. In The Darker Side of Dawn, he asserts the paradoxical inversion of the duality-unity principle, declaring, every traditional ontological formulation affirms the duality of unity as well as the unity of duality. Religious scripture and associated historical literature both abound in references to this principle, the most visible of which are found in the Taoist, Tantric, both Buddhist and Hindu, Manichaean, and Hellenistic Gnostic expressions, but which are recognized nonetheless in all the major religious traditions. Moreover, this principle was a central element of pre-Socratic thought, as evidenced by the Table of 10 Opposites, formulated by Pythagoras, and preserved by way of Aristotle in his Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 5. Coomaraswamy saw the principle of polarity or duality, and concomitantly the coincidentia oppositorum, everywhere, and in every manifested operation. It led him to write that, however the ultimate truth of dualism may be repudiated, a kind of dualism is logically unavoidable for all practical purposes, because any world in time and space, or that could be described in words or by mathematical symbols, must be one of contraries, both quantitative and qualitative. For example, long and short, good and evil. And even if it could be otherwise, a world without these opposites would be one from which all potentiality to act would be excluded, not a world that could be inhabited by human beings such as we. There is, perhaps most importantly, the human perspective, the perspective of divinity, in which these two opposites are in a constant state of intercourse, striving for resolution or reconciliation. In his selected letters, Coomaraswamy makes repeated reference to Aquinas' formulation of duo sunt in homine, literally, two there are in man, further illustrating the centrality of this principle in his thought. The two sides are allied with their correlatives, as Blavatsky points out. God, spirit, light, or consciousness versus Satan, soul, darkness, and the unconscious. The correspondences of the principle of polarities, such as the various polarities of manifestation, are numerous and cannot all be treated here. Carl Jung, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, a work devoted to this principle of polarity, duality, and its synthesis, gives an elaborate list. To begin with, they form a dualism. For instance, the opposites are humidum, moist, siccum, dry, frigidum, cold, calidum, warm, superiora, upper, higher, inferiora, lower, spiritus, anima, spirit, soul, corpus, body, caelum, heaven, terra, earth, and so on for 11 more opposites in this particular list. One interesting latter-day example of duality as complements is the work being done in neurology regarding the dual cerebral hemispheres theory of the brain, and the effects this has on prevailing notions of human cognition. The right and left hemispheres of the brain, conjoined by the corpus callosum, have been found to control entirely different cognitive functions, and this is having significant effects on the scientific approach to epistemology. The interest of this theory to metaphysics is that, if correct, it serves as a superlative example of the law of correspondence, that is, the principle of polarity applied directly to the substance of cognition. However interesting and multifarious the correspondences of polarity may be in the sensible realm, they are still contingent and still only point to the supreme aspect of polarity, its resolution or synthesis, the duad into a monad. This resolution is the coincidentia oppositorum. Further descriptions of it here would be repetitious. It is sufficient to note one or two other passages from traditional sources. Guénon writes that complementarism itself, which is still duality, must at a certain degree disappear before unity, its two terms sort of equilibrizing and neutralizing themselves when uniting to indissolubly fuse in the primordial indifferentiation. This two subsumed in one is the final goal of human endeavor, the ens perfectissimum of Western metaphysics, total liberation, moksha, nirvana. It is identity with unconditioned being, since liberation differs from all human or post-human states that being may have traversed in order to realize it, inasmuch as it is the realization of the ultimate and unconditioned state. It is, in short, the most sublime and sacred theme of the tradition and Theosophy, alluded to in the various religio-philosophical and mystical systems as total enlightenment, transformation, or God realization, terms peculiar to specific doctrines but which convey the same meaning. Stated in terms of the only tradition, it is complete synthesis, or coincidentia oppositorum, each pole transubstantiated into the other forming one of the two. This goal has been symbolized mythologically by the androgyne in many cultures, and esoterically in the late medieval alchemical material of the West upon which Jung drew so heavily. Further, it is the hieros gamos, or secret sacred marriage in all mystery traditions from time immemorial, of complete absorption of the self into the self of the neophyte, who from that point begins to live with God. A consistent and highly evident train in Coomaraswamy's writings, this concept of the syzygies as one appears in many concise statements, such as, in reference to the two selves, their marriage, consummated in the heart, is the hieros gamos, davan mitunum, and those in whom it has been perfected are no longer anyone, but as he is, who has never been anyone. Cause and effect. One way to describe the interplay or tension between two poles, which occurs inevitably whenever polarity exists, is action, karma. The term karma is certainly much abused as it appears increasingly in the modern vocabulary of the West. It is given an unwarranted etiologic character, or it is used frequently as an excuse for the immediate results of personal stupidity. No less infrequently, karma is misapplied to a principle to which it is genuinely related, transmigration. These abuses and misapplications of the term are thought by traditional writers to have largely been the handiwork of modern theosophists, since one so often encounters the principles of karma and reincarnation in the worldview of modern theosophy as an ensemble, and perhaps to a certain degree with regard to the later developments of the Theosophical movement, 1910 to 1950, some of these accusations may be justified. But like the case of reincarnation and evolution, the perception of the original modern theosophical view of karma is divorced from the reality, especially when applied to Blavatsky's treatment of the term. The pristine dissemination of modern theosophy is consistent with the precepts of the tradition regarding both causality and action, karma. Coomaraswamy provides a passage that conveniently incorporates three of these first principles under discussion here: periodicity, aviternity, and causality. He writes, in other words, the Pitrayana, the patriarchal voyage of the pilgrim, is a symbolic representation of what is now called the doctrine of reincarnation, and is bound up with the notion of latent, adrista, or apurva causality. The purely symbolic character of the whole conception is made all the more apparent when we reflect that from the standpoint of very truth and in the absolute present there can be no distinctions made of cause and effect, and that what is often spoken of as the destruction of karma, or more correctly as a destruction of the latent effects of works effected by understanding and implied with mukti, is not really a destruction of valid causes, but simply a realization of the identity of cause and effect. In this quote, Coomaraswamy gives a definition of karma that extends beyond its merely etymological sense, from which Guénon seems reluctant to stray at all, of action. Karma, in this passage, is equated to the latent effects of works. It was Guénon's fidelity to prescriptive etymological usage of terms, perhaps, that precluded him from expanding the definition of karma beyond action. He had, as has been noted, lamented sloppy use of language and the evisceration of metaphysical terms in modernity. He more often mentions what karma is not than what it is, except for his references to its being simply action. Le mot karma, en effet, signifie tout simplement action et rien d'autre. The word karma, in effect, simply means action and nothing more. But this reluctance did not stop Guénon's colleagues in the tradition from expanding its use. Marco Pallas, in an essay entitled Living One's Karma, adds the inevitable corollary to action. Cosmic flux, together with its parallel conception of karma, concordant action and reaction, as the determinant of each being's part in that flux, is an essential feature of all the traditions directly or indirectly deriving from India. Karma, therefore, as Pallas correctly observes, covers both action and reaction. For reaction, though it is contingent upon ingenerate action, is nonetheless action itself. This principle of the essential realm applies subsequently, by the law of correspondence, to the substantial realm. With regard to the latter, the homology can be observed in the first part of Isaac Newton's third law of motion, published in Principia in 1686. To every action there is always opposed an equal reaction, or the mutual actions of two bodies upon each other are always equal, and directed to contrary parts. It should be made clear, however, that this homologue cannot imply causality, but only, in Pallas's words, concordant action and reaction, and that reference to bodies in Newton's formulation is relative strictly to the physical world. The question of causality relative to the concept of karma is as much a semantic one as a metaphysical one. The equation action, cause, reaction, effect is certainly not a dislogical proposition. Therefore, if one accepts this equation as valid, the concept of karma must necessarily include cause and effect. For example, Coomaraswamy's latent effects of works. As to the correlation between the understanding of the term by traditionalists and modern theosophists, there is nothing fatalistic or deterministic in Blavatsky's definition of karma. Rather, the following quote demonstrates that hers is consistent with Coomaraswamy's and Pallas's understanding. This law, karma, whether conscious or unconscious, predestines nothing and no one. It exists from and in eternity, truly, for it is eternity itself. And as such, since no act can be co-equal with eternity, it cannot be said to act, for it is action itself. Karma creates nothing, nor does it design. It is the man who plans and creates causes, and karmic law adjusts the effects, which adjustment is not an act but universal harmony, tending ever to resume its original position, like a bow, which bent down too forcibly rebounds with corresponding vigor. Karma is an absolute and eternal law in the world of manifestation, and as there can only be one absolute, as one eternal ever-present cause, believers in karma cannot be regarded as atheists or materialists, still less as fatalists, for karma is one with the unknowable, of which it is an aspect in its effects in the phenomenal world. In the final analysis, there can be said to be only one cause, whose effect is manifestation. But to invoke again the aid of the law of correspondence, like cycles within cycles, there are microcauses too, or at least what appear to be microcauses. The real cause is the causeless cause, the absolute, and all micro or contingent causes, and thus all micro or contingent effects proceed from the first cause. This is not a tautology. It is a metaphysical first principle, interdependent with the others and beyond the powers of reason to apprehend. One can only construct absolute causality and relative causality, the latter being frequently expressed as the proverbial chicken and the egg argument. But the concept of karma would inhere in both aspects of causality. Karma, or action, is therefore the action of linking, or the linking process in the traditional and theosophic perception of causality, restated here by Coomaraswamy. The traditional and orthodox doctrine is a recognition of the causal chain by which all events are linked in a phenomenal succession, but of their intrinsic and not extrinsic operation. In other words, viewed from in stasis, or inherent unity and wholeness, via gnosis, this process is seen as one giant universal cause with one giant universal effect. Viewed from ecstasis, or apparent multiplicity and differentiation, this process is seen as innumerable causes with innumerable effects. And karma, or action, adjusts and so pervades the entire process, regardless of how it is perceived. Gnoseology. The last of the first principles to be considered here, by which the intricacies of the former ones are apprehended, constitutes the great dividing line between modern Western philosophy and the tradition. Like the coincidentia oppositorum, this principle of gnosis, prajna, or intellectual intuition, was briefly discussed in the preceding section. In addition to the process and or human faculty of intellectual intuition, gnosis is also used to refer to the ancient wisdom or tradition itself, but it is the process faculty usage of the inclusive term that is under discussion as gnoseology. Whatever may be said about the variations in the approaches to gnosis as a process among the traditional and theosophical writers, one thing is certain. All of them unequivocally held to an intuitive method for the comprehension of recondite metaphysical issues and for the apprehension of metaphysical first principles. The precision for which Guénon strives in this definition of the faculty gives us a better insight into its nature. To be more precise, it should be said that the faculty we are now referring to is intellectual intuition, the reality of which has been consistently denied by modern philosophy, which has failed to grasp its real nature whenever it has not preferred simply to ignore it. This faculty can also be called the pure intellect, following the practice of Aristotle and his scholastic successors, for to them the intellect was in fact that faculty which possessed a direct knowledge of principle. Schuon, following Guénon, states in his book Gnosis that this faculty is our participation in the perspective of the divine subject. The renowned scholar of Gnosticism, Elaine Pagels, though neither a traditionalist nor a theosophist, also speaks of gnosis as intuition. The name Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which can be translated knowledge. It does not mean intellectual or scientific knowledge, but intuitive knowledge. It is like the German kennen, as distinct from wissen, or the French connaître as distinct from savoir. Kelly, citing Eckhart, states that when Eckhart says that nothing is more true than detached intellection grounded in pure intellect itself, he means that it is indefectible from the fact that its knowledge is immediate, and because, not being really distinct from its object, it is knowledge through identity. Coomaraswamy's perception and expressions of the concept of gnosis have already been discussed and shown to be intimately connected to Plato's theory of anamnesis. But he states in one very incisive sentence in a footnote to Svayamatrana Janua Cheli that the direction of a lower heaven attainable by merit and a higher attainable only by gnosis is one of the basic formulae of the Philosophia Perennis and is strongly emphasized in the Upanishads. Blavatsky completes the consensus. The whole essence of truth cannot be transmitted from mouth to ear, nor can any pen describe it, not even that of the recording angel, unless man finds the answer in the sanctuary of his own heart, in the innermost depths of his divine intuition. Even the professed empiricist Carl Jung states, "My psychological experience has shown time and again that certain contents issue from a psyche more complete than consciousness. They often contain a superior analysis or insight or knowledge which consciousness has not been able to produce. We have a suitable word for such occurrences, intuition." The number of possible quotes on this topic is endless. The point is sufficiently made. The intellectual intuition is a fundamental axiom of the tradition and theosophy, ancient and modern. This assertion is, in fact, the subject of a book by Dan Merker entitled Gnosis, an esoteric tradition of mystical visions and unions, which traces the principle in Western and Islamic culture, and whose Chapter 5 provides a useful definition of the term. The correlations and ramifications of Gnosis are both numerous and profound. More accurately, it should be said that the subjects of Gnosis are profound, primarily those of hierarchy and axiology. The notion of hierarchy, symbolized by the vertical axis mundi in its multiplicity of forms, in turn implies a hierarchical arrangement of the constituents of each person, one of them being the nous, or manas principle, which Coomaraswamy so consistently refers to, for example, in his essay entitled Manas. Again, by the law of correspondence, the emanation of the one life in a descending and reascending scale of hierarchic degrees, as Blavatsky phrases it, is seen equally in the hierarchic constituents of each individual. These constituents, described as bodies, sheaths, vehicles, envelopes, and so forth, depending upon the writer, range from the densest corporeality to the finest spiritual or intuitional mode. In G.R.S. Mead's Doctrine of the Subtle Body, for example, a sevenfold constitution of man's constituents is outlined, further condensed in a chapter in his The World Mystery, entitled The Vestures of the Soul. J.J. Portman did for these vestures what Mircea Eliade has done for religious ideas in his 4-volume Vehicles of Consciousness, that is, drawing from the world's religious texts everything pertaining to these vehicles. In Man and His Becoming, according to the Vedanta, Guénon outlines the envelopes of the self, the 5 vayus, or vital function, and elaborates further on this subject in Les États Multiples de l'Être. Whatever the system and however many bodies are attributed to each person, it usually varies from 3 to 7 according to the context. The important points are that they are all in essential agreement as to the existence of several denser and subtle bodies as constituting the human individual, that these bodies represent different functions and are arranged hierarchically, and that one of these bodies on the subtlest end of the scale is the seat of the intellectual intuition. Metaphysically, the intelligible realm is perceived via the medium of pure intellect, and since the inseparability of value and reality is the one constant character of the intelligible world, a world in which they were divorced would no longer be intelligible. Thus, hierarchy and axiology are intrinsically related, and ultimately determinable by intellectual intuition. Kelly, in discussing Eckhart's views, declares that the hierarchical relationship holds within each species as well as between species. This notion brings us to the troublesome question of a spiritual elect, or elite, in Guénon's words, and of the brotherhood, or lodge, as those terms were used by Blavatsky. By reason of its being a logical sequitur, there must be, in the traditional view, a hierarchy of homo intuitionis, a group of those with an irrepressible zetetic impulse who have developed their latent, inherent, intuitive capabilities through yogic disciplines or otherwise to an extraordinary degree. Such a group would be something like an association of Jivan Muktas, like the pneumatics of the Hellenistic Gnostics, though not in the ludicrous sense of a corporate organization or association with bylaws, and so on. Coomaraswamy is mute on the subject except for an etymological discussion of the term Mahatma, which he published as an essay under that title in 1939. Guénon, however, is not so laconic. On the one hand, he totally rejects the association of Mahatmas to which Blavatsky makes constant reference, saying they did not exist and were her creation alone. On the other, he devotes a whole chapter in Orient et Occident to discussing the constitution et rôle de l'élite, the elite consisting of liberated or near-liberated individuals who act as guides, teachers, and applicators of metaphysical principles to mundane existence. Elsewhere, he states that knowledge of the language of the birds is the prerogative of a high initiation, and that degrees of initiation are part of and identical to spiritual hierarchies. Guénon did not reject Blavatsky's brotherhood on the grounds that such a brotherhood or elite could not exist in reality. Rather, he rejected it because he believed Blavatsky to have been a fraud. Thus, none of the traditional or theosophical writers discounts either the possibility, feasibility, or indeed the desirability of such an organization of Illuminati who, by virtue of their activated cities and highly developed intuitions, would act as mediators between the society at large and the sublime and rationally inscrutable first principles of metaphysics. In fact, Guénon adds that this elite, whom he also refers to as guardians of the earth's sacred land, or mysteries, currently has a further obligation with respect to this sacred land. He writes that This sacred land, defended by guardians who keep it hidden from profane view, while assuring nevertheless certain exterior communications, is in effect invisible and inaccessible except for those who possess the requisite qualifications for entry. This statement does not merely approximate Blavatsky's assertion of the fact of such guardians that she made decades before Guénon wrote, it repeats the same fact. The Philosophia Perennis, Theosophy, and the Metaphysical First Principles, all as outlined in the preceding pages, is the vocation and purpose and defining essence of this group of Illuminati. In the tradition of Socrates, Ammonius Saccas, Plotinus, and Coomaraswamy, they would not advertise themselves, but would, within their circle of students and friends, help step down the lofty first principles of the tradition, thereby making elements of these principles accessible to the culture as a whole. Guénon proposes that a numerically small but well-established elite would suffice in order to give direction to the mass, which would respond to its suggestions without having the slightest idea of its existence or the means of its function. Thus, lines of communication are established between the intelligible realm of metaphysics and the sensible realm of culture, as has always been the condition in traditional cultures. These lines of communication can be dysfunctional or non-existent, and Coomaraswamy and Guénon so perceive them in modern Western culture. They can also be functional and harmonious, as they see them in archaic traditional cultures, and, though in serious decline, in some modern Eastern cultures. In the following part, attention will be given to this transformation of higher intelligible principles into sensible expression, that is, to how these first principles manifest in human cultures.